2:15 in the morning. The East China Sea, 90 miles east of the Zhoushan Archipelago. The Virginia-class fast attack submarine USS North Carolina drifted at 5 knots, its nuclear reactor humming with a low, predatory vibration that was completely masked by the ambient noise of the ocean. For 3 days, the 7,800-ton vessel had been a ghost, holding a fixed position inside a patrol box that the Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy considered their own private backyard. The crew was waiting for a single encrypted burst from Pacific Command that would change the nature of the Pacific conflict forever. The water at 100 meters depth was a crushing, cold weight of absolute blackness, smelling faintly of recycled oxygen and machine oil inside the pressurized hull. Outside, the currents of the Kuroshio moved like a slow, heavy river against the steel skin of the boat, carrying the distant, rhythmic pulses of civilian merchant traffic far above. In the control room of the USS North Carolina, the atmosphere was one of calculated, professional silence. The only light came from the soft blue and amber glow of the multifunction displays, casting long shadows across the faces of the watchstanders. Commander Robert Miller, the commanding officer, stood behind the 2 helmsmen, his arms folded across his chest. He was a man who lived by the clock and the sonar trace, and tonight, the clock was moving toward a hard deadline. The objective was the Eastern Theater Command headquarters at Zhoushan, a massive complex of concrete bunkers, satellite arrays, and reinforced piers that served as the brain of the Chinese naval machine. Intelligence had confirmed that the top leadership of the People's Liberation Army Navy was currently gathered there for a final strategic briefing. If the United States Navy could sever that connection, the entire regional fleet would be left blind and leaderless for the critical first 48 hours of the coming engagement. At the sonar console, the lead technician adjusted his headset, his eyes scanning the waterfall display of the ANBQQ-10 sonar system. He was searching for the signature of the Type 054A frigates that patrolled the perimeter of the Zhoushan restricted zone. The ocean was crowded with the noise of the modern world, but to the trained ear, the specific cavitation of a Chinese propulsion system was as distinct as a fingerprint. "Master Chief, give me a clean look at the acoustic environment," Commander Miller said, his voice low and steady. "Environment is stable, Captain," the Master Chief Petty Officer replied, his fingers dancing across the screen. "We have 3 surface contacts at range 25 miles, likely commercial tankers heading for Ningbo. No active pings from the inner screen. The thermal layer is holding at 45 meters, giving us a perfect acoustic ceiling to hide under." Commander Miller nodded. The stealth of the Virginia-class was not just about the hull coatings or the pump jet propulsor. It was about the mastery of the environment. Every sailor on board knew that a single loud tool drop or a mismanaged ballast tank could turn their billion-dollar warship into a target. In the midsection of the submarine, the Virginia payload tubes were already primed. Inside those massive vertical cylinders sat 12 Tomahawk land attack missile block 5 cruise missiles. Each missile was a masterpiece of precision engineering, carrying a 1,000-pound high-explosive warhead and a guidance system capable of flying through a specific window from 1,000 miles away. The weapons technicians had completed their final checks 20 minutes ago. The digital mission packages, containing the terrain contour matching data and GPS coordinates for the Zhoushan headquarters, had been uploaded and verified. The missiles were warm, their internal gyroscopes spinning, waiting for the high-pressure gas to eject them from the hull and into the air. At 2:22 in the morning, the communications officer turned in his chair, his face illuminated by a flashing red icon on his terminal. "Captain, we have a flash message from Pacific Command. Authentication code Delta X-Ray 904. The order is execute. Mission Iron Ghost is a go." The tension in the room did not break. It solidified. There were no cheers, no shouts of excitement. There was only the sound of men moving, with the practiced efficiency of a machine. "Executive Officer, verify the authentication," Miller ordered. The executive officer leaned over the terminal, comparing the incoming code to the physical authenticator kept in the ship's safe. Code is verified, Captain. Delta X-ray 9 or 4. Authority confirmed. Very well, Miller said, stepping toward the center of the room. Initialize the launch sequence for the Virginia payload tubes. All missiles, salvo fire, interval 3 seconds. Target is Zhoushan Naval Headquarters. Make your depth 60 meters. Bring us to launch speed 3 knots. The deck tilted slightly as the USS North Carolina began its slow ascent toward the launch depth. The smell of the air seemed to sharpen, the metallic tang of ozone mixing with the sweat of 100 men focused on a single task. Below the waves, the Ghost was preparing to speak with a voice of fire. 2:30 in the morning. The East China Sea. The USS North Carolina reached its launch depth of 60 meters, the massive hull stabilizing as the automated depth control system countered the rhythmic pull of the surface swells. Inside the Virginia payload tubes, the pressurized gas generators reached their peak operating temperature, a dull, industrial heat that radiated through the thick steel bulkheads of the missile compartment. This was the moment of peak vulnerability. For the next 90 seconds, the submarine would be tethered to the surface by a trail of fire and white smoke. Tubes 1 through 4 flooded and equalized, the weapons officer announced, his voice tight with the focus of a man who had practiced this sequence 10,000 times in a simulator. Outer doors are open. Weapons are slaved to the global positioning system. We have a green board. Commander Miller gripped the edge of the navigation table, feeling the subtle shift in the boat's buoyancy. Launch on my mark. 3, 2, 1, mark. A muffled, heavy thump vibrated through the entire 7,000-ton frame of the North Carolina, followed immediately by another and another. It was the sound of high-pressure gas punching the first 3,000-pound Tomahawk missiles out of their vertical tubes. The missiles cleared the hull in a fraction of a second, their protective nose caps shattering as they hit the cold seawater. 10 meters below the surface, the solid fuel booster motors ignited with a violent, muffled roar that sent a shockwave through the water, visible on the sonar screens as a whiteout of acoustic energy. The first Tomahawk broke the surface of the East China Sea in a spectacular plume of white spray and orange flame. The booster motor pushed the missile 300 feet into the air before the small, folding wings snapped into place, and the Williams 404 turbofan engine kicked into life with a high-pitched scream. The missile dipped its nose, leveling off just 50 feet above the dark water. It was now a self-contained predator, its internal computer cross-referencing its position against the digital map of the ocean floor. Behind it, 11 more Tomahawks followed in rapid succession, creating a staggered line of white exhaust trails that stretched toward the western horizon. The mission parameters for Operation Iron Ghost were specific and unforgiving. The Zhoushan Naval Headquarters was not a single building, but a sprawling complex of hardened command centers, underground fuel farms, and the Pier 7 bunkers which housed the data links for the entire Eastern Theater Command. To destroy it, the Tomahawks would have to navigate a gauntlet of HQ-9 surface-to-air missile batteries and the sophisticated electronic jamming suites of the Chinese Coastal Defense Network. The 12 missiles were programmed to fly a circuitous route, avoiding the known radar gaps of the primary air defense screens. They would stay below the radar horizon, hugging the wave tops at a speed of 550 miles per hour. The decapitation strategy relied on the fact that the Chinese command structure was highly centralized. If the nerve center at Zhoushan was destroyed, the individual ship captains of the People's Liberation Army Navy would be forced to operate without real-time satellite intelligence or high-level tactical coordination. Inside the North Carolina, the launch thump had been replaced by a deathly silence. The crew watched the status monitors as the 12 blue icons representing their missiles moved steadily away from the submarine's position. The air in the control room was thick with the smell of ozone and the recycled breath of 80 sailors, all 12 away and transitioning to cruise phase, the weapons officer reported. No immediate counter-detection from the surface screen. The frigates at range 24 miles are still pinging their original search sectors. They haven't seen us yet. Steady as she goes, Miller said, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. Maintain 3 knots. We stay at launch depth for another 5 minutes. To ensure all telemetry is recorded, then we dive for the cellar. I want us under the thermal layer before the Chinese realize the missiles didn't come from a carrier deck. The strategic necessity of this strike was absolute. For decades, the Zhoushan base had been the springboard for Chinese naval power in the Pacific. It was the home port for the Type 055 destroyers and the massive amphibious assault ships that threatened the regional balance. By striking now, the United States was not just destroying buildings. It was erasing the command and control infrastructure that allowed the Chinese Navy to function as a unified force. The missiles were now 60 miles out, their flight paths converging as they approached the Ningbo coastline. The terrain contour matching system began to scan the ground below, recognizing the rocky outcrops and coastal hills of the archipelago. The Tomahawks adjusted their altitude, rising slightly to clear the coastal cliffs before diving back down into the valleys to stay hidden from the long-range radars inland. 30 seconds to coastal crossing, the sonar technician whispered. The East China Sea remained dark and seemingly empty. But beneath the surface, the USS North Carolina was already preparing for the inevitable retaliatory hunt. The mission had only just begun, and the world was about to hear the sound of 12 1,000-pound warheads finding their mark. 2:40 in the morning. Zhoushan Island, at coordinates 29 degrees 58 minutes north, 122 degrees 10 minutes east. The Eastern Theater Command Headquarters was a sprawling fortress of reinforced concrete and hardened steel, built to withstand a direct nuclear exchange. To the Chinese People's Liberation Army, Navy, Zhoushan was more than a base. It was the nerve center for every maritime operation in the East China Sea, and the primary staging ground for any move against Taiwan. Above ground, the facility was a forest of high-gain satellite dishes and rotating radar arrays, their white surfaces gleaming under the dim perimeter lights. Below the surface, buried under 60 feet of granite and lead-lined shielding, lay the command and control center. Inside the bunker, the air was chilled to exactly 18 degrees Celsius to protect the massive server banks that processed real-time data from hundreds of ships and thousands of sensors. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling liquid crystal displays, showing the tactical situation across the Pacific. Dozens of officers in dark blue uniforms moved with quiet urgency, monitoring the movements of United States carrier strike groups and the silent, invisible threats lurking beneath the waves. Surrounding this vital heart was a multi-layered defensive umbrella known as the Iron Curtain of the East. The outermost ring consisted of HQ-9 surface-to-air missile batteries, their long, cylindrical canisters pointed toward the dark sky. These missiles were designed to intercept high-altitude bombers and ballistic threats at ranges of over 200 kilometers. Closer in, the base was protected by Type 730 close-in weapon systems, 7-barreled, 30mm Gatling guns capable of spitting out 5,000 rounds per minute to shred incoming projectiles. The Chinese radar operators were currently focused on the high-altitude corridors, searching for the telltale signatures of F-35 Lightning fighters or the massive B-2 Spirit stealth bombers. They did not expect a low-altitude, subsonic strike delivered from a single submarine operating deep within their defensive perimeter. The clutter of the rocky archipelago and the heavy sea state created a natural mask that the Tomahawk land attack missiles were now exploiting with lethal precision. The 12 missiles launched from the USS North Carolina were now less than 5 minutes from impact. They had separated into 3 distinct 4-missile cells, each approaching the island from a different bearing to saturate the defensive processors. The first cell was screaming through the narrow channels between the outlying islands, their radar altimeters keeping them just 30 feet above the churning whitecaps. The salt spray coated the missile's composite skins, but their internal heaters kept the vital optical sensors clear. One of the Tomahawks utilized its digital scene matching area correlation system, a high-resolution camera that took rapid-fire snapshots of the terrain below and compared them to a preloaded satellite map. The missile recognized a specific limestone ridge and adjusted its flight path by 3 degrees, banking hard to stay within the radar shadow of the hills. The internal Williams 404 turbofan engine hummed with a consistent, mechanical drone burning through its high-energy fuel at a rate of 6 gallons per minute. At the headquarters, the first sign of trouble was not a radar contact, but a sudden, localized disruption in the regional communication network. The Tomahawks carried miniature electronic warfare suites that began to broadcast low-power noise. As they crossed the final 5-mile threshold, it was a subtle ghost in the machine, a momentary flickering of the satellite uplinks that caused the senior duty officer to look up from his console with a frown of confusion. Check the synchronization on the Pier 7 data link, the officer ordered in Mandarin, his voice echoing in the sterile silence of the bunker. We are seeing a 3-millisecond lag in the encrypted stream. It was already too late. The lag was the result of 12 1,000-pound warheads entering the final terminal phase of their flight. The missiles were no longer skimming the water. They were beginning their pop-up maneuvers, climbing steeply to 300 feet, before diving vertically onto their pre-designated targets. This maneuver ensured that the kinetic energy of the impact would be maximized, driving the warheads deep into the structures before detonation. The primary target was the satellite farm. If the dishes were destroyed, the Eastern Theater Command would lose its ability to talk to its nuclear-armed submarines and its carrier groups at sea. The secondary targets were the Pier 7 bunkers, which housed the fiber-optic nodes connecting the base to the mainland. The United States Navy wasn't just looking to kill personnel, they were looking to lobotomize the entire regional military structure. As the first Tomahawk reached the crest of its terminal climb, its passive infrared seeker locked onto the heat signature of the main command bunker's ventilation shafts. The cold night air was torn apart by the sudden, shrieking roar of the turbofan engine at full throttle. The mission was moving from the shadows into the blinding light of a kinetic strike. 2:42 in the morning. The coastal defense sector of Zhoushan Island. The silence of the night was shattered as the first long-range search radar at the Dinghai battery finally achieved a flickering, unstable lock. The system, a Russian-made S-300 variant integrated into the Chinese network, began to wail with an automated warning tone that echoed through the hardened concrete bunkers. On the green phosphor screens, 12 tiny, fast-moving blips appeared, emerging from the ground clutter of the surrounding islands like ghosts materializing from a fog. They were low, moving at 550 miles per hour, and they were already inside the minimum engagement envelope of the heavy surface-to-air missiles. Target identified as cruise missiles, low altitude, high subsonic speed, the radar operator shouted in Mandarin, his hands flying across the keyboard to hand off the tracking data to the short-range interceptors. Bearing 085. Range, 7 kilometers. They are masked by the terrain. The HQ-9 batteries, the pride of the Eastern Theater Command's air defense, were useless against targets hugging the valley floors. The massive missiles were designed to kill high-flying tankers and stealth fighters, not to hunt sea skimmers weaving through narrow granite canyons. The responsibility for the base's survival shifted instantly to the inner ring of the defense, the Type 730 close-in weapon systems. Across the ridgeline surrounding the naval headquarters, 6 of these 7-barreled Gatling guns began to traverse, their high-speed motors whining as they tracked the incoming heat signatures. These weapons were the last line of defense, capable of firing 5,030mm armor-piercing incendiary rounds per minute. Each gun was slaved to its own dedicated EFR-1 tracking radar, creating a wall of lead and tungsten that no aircraft was supposed to survive. As the first cell of 4 Tomahawks crested the final ridge before the harbor, the close-in weapon systems opened fire. The night sky was suddenly ripped apart by long, glowing fingers of tracer fire. The sound was not a sequence of individual shots, but a continuous, soul-shaking roar, the sound of giant sheets of canvas being torn in half. Thousands of glowing red rounds poured into the sky, searching for the leading missile. The first Tomahawk in the stack took a direct hit to its guidance nose cone. The 30mm rounds shredded the delicate electronics instantly, and the missile tumbled out of the air, cartwheeling into a forested hillside where it detonated in a brilliant orange fireball. The remaining 3 missiles in the first cell immediately executed their programmed defensive maneuvers, jinking left and right with high G turns that the Chinese automated trackers struggled to follow. Inside the command and control center, the senior officers watched the tactical display with growing dread. The Iron Curtain was being tested by a saturation attack that moved too fast for human intervention. The 12 missiles had been timed to arrive within seconds of each other, overwhelming the processing power of the defensive computers. "Engage the electronic countermeasures," the theater commander barked, slamming his fist onto the map table. "Jam their GPS links. Flood the channels." High-power microwave emitters on the roof of the headquarters began to pulse, sending out invisible waves of energy intended to blind the Tomahawks. But the Block 5 missiles were hardened against such tactics. When the GPS signal was lost, the internal inertial navigation systems took over, using laser ring gyroscopes to maintain their course with a drift of less than a few meters per hour. The missiles didn't need a satellite to find a target as large as a naval base, while the primary defense guns were focused on the first cell. The second and third cells of 4 missiles each were approaching from the north and south, flanking the main radar arrays. One of these missiles was targeted specifically at the power substation that fed the entire island's military grid. It flew so low that it clipped the tops of the perimeter fence, its shadow racing across the dark pavement of the motor pool. 5 miles out at sea, the USS North Carolina was no longer watching the flight. Commander Miller had ordered the boat to dive deep, seeking the safety of the 400-meter mark. The mission was now in the hands of the machines. The silence inside the submarine was absolute, the crew knowing that within minutes, the geopolitical map of the Pacific would be irrevocably altered. Above ground, the air smelled of burnt cordite and the ozone of high-power electronics. The second Tomahawk was caught by a secondary gun battery, exploding in midair and showering the pier with burning debris. But 10 more missiles were still in the air, and the closest was now less than 800 meters from the command and control center's primary air intake. The defense was failing. The gap in the Iron Curtain had been found, and the cost of that failure was about to be measured in thousands of tons of reinforced concrete. 2:44 in the morning. The final terminal phase of Operation Iron Ghost. The remaining 10 Tomahawk missiles were no longer skimming the water. They had entered their pre-programmed terminal high-angle maneuvers. At a range of only 2 miles from the Zhoushan headquarters, the missiles pulled hard on their elevators, screaming upward at a 60-degree angle to reach an altitude of 1,000 feet. From this height, their seekers had a perfect, unobstructed view of the base layout. The onboard computers compared the infrared heat signatures of the buildings to the satellite imagery in their memory banks, locking onto the specific coordinates of the command and control center and the Pier 7 communication vaults. The air around the harbor was thick with the smell of salt and the heavy, acrid scent of burning propellant from the intercepted missiles. The night was lit by the frantic, crisscrossing arcs of tracer fire as the remaining 30mm close-in weapon systems attempted to lead the diving targets. The sound was a deafening, rhythmic hammering that vibrated through the hulls of the ships docked nearby. The first 2 missiles in the southern cell accelerated to 600 miles per hour. As they began their vertical plunge, their targets were the primary satellite arrays, the eyes and ears of the Eastern Theater Command. The Seekers ignored the decoy flares being launched by the base defenders, staying locked on the massive white dishes that dominated the central ridge. The first 1,000-pound warhead punched straight through the center of the 30-meter satellite array, the kinetic force alone snapping the heavy steel support girders like dry twigs. 1 microsecond later, the warhead detonated. A fireball, the color of magnesium, bleached the sky white, expanding in a perfect, searing sphere that vaporized the delicate electronics and sent molten aluminum raining down across the motor pool. The second missile followed 4 seconds later, striking the base of the array and collapsing the entire structure into a tangled heap of burning metal. The third and fourth missiles focused on the primary command and control center. They slammed into the reinforced concrete roof with a combined force of 2,000 pounds of high explosives. The specialized penetrator warheads drove 10 feet into the granite and lead shielding before the delayed fuses triggered the main charge. The explosion blew the heavy steel ventilation louvers outward, sending a pressure wave through the underground corridors that crushed every internal partition and sent shards of glass and equipment flying at lethal speeds. Inside the bunker, the physical reaction was catastrophic. The theater commander and his senior staff were thrown against the bulkhead walls by the sheer force of the overpressure. Their eardrums ruptured by the sudden atmospheric spike. The massive tactical displays shattered, raining shards of liquid crystal onto the officers below. 40 tons of reinforced concrete and rebar from the ceiling collapsed, pinning the main communication table to the floor and severing the primary fiber-optic lines. The emergency lights flickered and died, replaced by the choking, black dust of pulverized masonry and the smell of ozone. On the surface, the crews of the Type 730 gun mounts scrambled to reload. But the heat from the secondary explosions was so intense it began to melt the hydraulic lines of the mounts. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the central plaza for exactly 3 seconds, broken only by the crackle of burning jet fuel. Then, the Pier 7 fuel farm, ignited by the debris of the third impact, went up in a secondary detonation that shook the entire island to its foundation. A column of oily black smoke rose 2,000 feet into the air, illuminated from below by a deep, pulsing orange glow. The 5th and 6th missiles found the Pier 7 communication vaults. These missiles used tandem charge warheads designed to defeat hardened bunkers. The first charge cleared the protective earth and concrete, and the second charge detonated inside the server rooms. The impact severed the last remaining hardline connection between the Zhoushan headquarters and the mainland. In a single instant, the Eastern Theater Command went dark. The tactical vacuum was immediate and absolute. Across the East China Sea, the captains of the Chinese frigates and destroyers suddenly found their long-range data links dead. The satellite feeds that had provided them with the positions of United States forces flickered and were replaced by static. The coordinated Iron Curtain of the East had been decapitated. The remaining 4 Tomahawks completed their runs, striking the secondary power substation and the reinforced hangar for the base's rotary wing assets. The substation erupted in a series of brilliant blue electrical arcs as the transformers shorted out, plunging the entire naval base into total darkness, save for the raging fires at the impact sites. The mission had achieved its primary objective in less than 90 seconds of kinetic action. The brain of the Chinese naval machine had been physically destroyed, leaving the regional fleet blind, deaf, and disconnected from its leadership. 2:46 in the morning. The central command sector of Zhoushan Island. While the initial strikes had shattered the surface arrays, the final 4 Tomahawk missiles, specifically designated as the heavy penetrator variants, entered their terminal dive. These weapons were not aimed at the sprawling satellite farms or the radar masts. Their target was the primary underground command node, a 3-story bunker buried 60 feet beneath a layer of reinforced granite. The missiles accelerated to their maximum velocity, their internal sensors filtering out the thick black smoke and the strobe-like flashes of the burning fuel farm. The trigger was squeezed by the logic processors of the lead missile. The turbofan engine screamed at its red line as the weapon plunged toward the ventilation exhaust port of the main bunker. The heat blast from the missile's exhaust washed across the scorched pavement of the courtyard, igniting the spilled hydraulic fluid from a destroyed truck. The missile shrieked through the air, a white column of fire punching downward into the darkness of the intake shaft. The sound of its passing was a physical blow, cracking the remaining windows of the nearby barracks. The 1,000-pound tandem charge warhead punched straight through the 12-inch steel blast door at the base of the shaft, driving deep into the center of the command floor before the main detonator triggered. A detonation followed that cracked eardrums and compressed every chest in the underground compartment. The explosion did not just destroy the room. It turned the high-pressure server racks into shrapnel and sent the heavy tactical map table flying into the ceiling. The floor itself split along the structural weld seams, and a fireball that bleached the underground darkness white. erupted instantly, consuming the oxygen in the lower 3 levels. The defenders reacted with a mix of disciplined desperation and total chaos. On the surface, the crews of the remaining Type 730 close-in weapon systems wrenched their turrets around, but the smoke was now so dense that their tracking radars were backscattering off the soot. One gunner fired a blind 5-second burst, 500 rounds of tungsten tearing through the air and shredding the upper floor of an empty dormitory. But the third and fourth missiles were already past him. The surviving officers inside the bunker's secondary levels attempted to engage the fire suppression systems, but the blast wave had already severed the main water lines, leaving them to fight the chemical fires with handheld extinguishers that were useless against the heat of burning missile propellant. The immediate aftermath was a scene of absolute structural failure. The central spire of the command complex, weakened by the internal overpressure, groaned and tilted 7 degrees to the east before the support pillars gave way. 6 tons of steel and concrete fell straight down, pancaking the upper offices and sealing the main entrance to the underground complex. Black smoke, thick with the smell of burning plastic, and something far worse, boiled out of the crater where the ventilation shaft had once been. The primary communication vault at Pier 7 was no longer a building. It was a smoking hole in the ground, its reinforced walls ripped open like wet cardboard. The silence that followed, the final explosion, was not a natural quiet. It was the dead stillness of a facility that had been completely severed from its nervous system. The heat from the fires was so intense that the asphalt on the nearby pier began to bubble and liquefy. Of the 12 missiles launched by the USS North Carolina, 10 had found their primary marks with surgical precision. The Eastern Theater Command was no longer a functioning military headquarters. It was a graveyard of twisted metal and shattered glass, illuminated by the flickering orange light of 100 secondary fires. 2:50 in the morning, the East China Sea, 30 miles west of the USS North Carolina's last known launch position. The ocean was no longer a silent sanctuary. Above the waves, the air was filled with the frantic, high-pitched whine of turboshaft engines, as 4 Chinese Z-9 helicopters surged away from the decks of the nearest surface screen. These aircraft were the hounds of the People's Liberation Army Navy, equipped with dipping sonar and airdropped acoustic buoys designed to find the predator that had just decapitated their regional command. 2 Type 54A frigates, the Binzhou and the Shuzhou, were now charging at 30 knots toward the estimated launch point. Their bows sliced through the 2-meter swells, throwing massive curtains of white spray into the dark air. On their bridges, the officers were no longer operating under the calm of a routine patrol. They were driven by a mixture of shock and a desperate, burning need for retaliation. The burning horizon at Zhoushan was visible even from 30 miles away, a jagged orange scar against the western sky. Activate active sonar, maximum power. The commanding officer of the Binzhou ordered, his voice trembling with a cold, controlled rage. I want every decibel we have pushed into the water. If that submarine is still in this sector, I want to crack its hull with the sound alone. The sonar operators engaged the bow-mounted active arrays. Deep beneath the surface, the water was suddenly hammered by a series of rhythmic, metallic pings that carried the energy of a physical blow. The sound waves traveled for miles, striking every rock, every school of fish, and the steel skin of any vessel in their path. It was an acoustic searchlight, stripping away the shadows where a submarine normally lived. Inside the USS North Carolina, the sound of the Chinese sonar hitting the hull was like a hammer striking a hollow pipe. It was a sharp, ringing, metallic chirp that echoed through every compartment, from the torpedo room to the engine space. The crew sat in absolute stillness, some holding their breath, as if the sound of their own lungs could give them away. "Rig for ultra quiet," Commander Miller whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the ventilation. "All non-essential systems off. No tool movements, no talking. We are a hole in the water." The Virginia-class submarine was now at a depth of 300 meters, hovering just above its crush depth. Miller had maneuvered the boat, into a thermal layer, a sharp transition in water temperature that acted as an acoustic mirror. If the submarine stayed beneath this layer, the active pings from the Chinese frigates would often bounce off the temperature boundary and reflect back toward the surface, hiding the boat in a zone of acoustic silence. The sonar technician on the North Carolina watched his display as the Chinese Z-9 helicopters began to drop their active buoys. On the screen, dozens of small green circles appeared, each one representing a source of active sonar noise. The Chinese were attempting to box in the sector, creating a grid of sound that would leave the submarine with no direction to turn. "They're dropping a line of buoys every 500 yards, Captain," the technician reported via a headset. "They're trying to find our baffles. The frigates are closing at 30 knots, bearing 095. "Maintain current heading," Miller ordered. 2 knots, slow and steady. "We don't want to create any cavitation on the propeller blades. Let the current of the Kuroshio push us east. We'll drift out of their search box while they're still looking for a moving target." The tension inside the submarine was a physical weight. The air was growing thick and warm as the air conditioning was dialed back to its minimum setting to reduce noise. Sweat beaded on the foreheads of the men in the control room. They were 7,000 tons of nuclear-powered machinery, but in this moment, they were a silent ghost trying to slip through a graveyard. Above them, the Chinese frigates were not just searching. They were preparing for a kill. The Binzhou's weapon technicians were already arming the U-8 anti-submarine missiles. These weapons were designed to be launched from a vertical tube, fly 10 miles through the air, and then drop a lightweight torpedo into the water directly on top of a suspected sonar contact. "I have a possible contact," the sonar lead on the Binzhou shouted, pointing to a faint, rhythmic return on his screen. "Bearing 082. Range 4,000 yards. It's faint, but it's holding steady below the layer." The Chinese commander didn't hesitate. In the wake of the destruction at Zhoushan, he wasn't looking for a positive identification. He was looking for blood. "Fire 1, fire 2. Pattern spread." 2 vertical launch cells on the deck of the frigate erupted in a blast of white smoke and orange flame. The U-8 missiles shrieked into the night sky, their rocket motors carving twin arcs of fire over the East China Sea. The hunt had moved from a search to an engagement, and the USS North Carolina was now the target of a coordinated, high-tech execution. 2:54 in the morning. The East China Sea, 60 miles east of Ningbo, the 2 Yu-8 anti-submarine missiles reached the apex of their ballistic flight 3 miles above the dark, churning surface of the ocean. At the precise coordinate calculated by the frigate Binzhou's fire control computer, the rocket motors detached, and the nose cones deployed small, high-drag parachutes. Suspended beneath each parachute was a Mark 54 lightweight torpedo, its internal sensors already warming up for the hunt. The torpedoes hit the water with a dual, heavy splash that was instantly picked up by the sonar suite of the USS North Carolina, 300 meters below. To the sonar technician, the sound was unmistakable. The slap gurgle of airdropped ordnance entering the environment. Torpedoes in the water. Bearings 082 and 085. Passive sonar shows high-speed cavitation. "They're active. I have a ping. They're looking for us." Commander Miller didn't blink. He had spent 20 years preparing for the 3 minutes that were about to follow. Left full rudder. Increase speed to 15 knots. Deployed 2 acoustic countermeasures from the internal launchers. We need to give those torpedoes something else to talk to. In the aft section of the submarine, 2 small, cylindrical canisters were ejected into the slipstream. These were mobile submarine simulators, sophisticated decoys designed to broadcast the exact acoustic signature of a Virginia-class nuclear submarine. As they moved away from the North Carolina, they began to emit the rhythmic thrum of a nuclear reactor and the specific frequency of a pump jet propulsor. The 2 Chinese torpedoes, moving at 45 knots, locked on to the loudest acoustic returns. Their internal logic processors compared the signals. 1 torpedo veered left, chasing the first decoy toward the deep water of the trench. The second torpedo, however, remained focused on the knuckle of disturbed water created by the North Carolina's sudden increase in speed. Incoming torpedo is at range 1,000 yards and closing, the executive officer reported, his eyes fixed on the tactical plot. It's ignored the second decoy. It's got a solid lock on our wash. All ahead flank, Miller ordered, his hands gripping the brass rail of the periscope pedestal. Execute a snap turn, 30 degrees to port. Dive to 400 meters. Blow the negative tank to get us down fast. The deck of the 7,800-ton submarine tilted sharply downward at a 20-degree angle. The crew braced themselves against consoles and bulkheads as the massive vessel groaned under the stress of the maneuver. The smell of hot hydraulic fluid and recycled air filled the compartment. Outside, the water pressure increased, pushing against the high-strength steel hull with millions of pounds of force. The torpedo was now 500 yards away, its active sonar pinging at a frantic rate. It was a high-pitched, metallic shriek that echoed through the North Carolina's hull like a banshee. "Now," Miller whispered. "Release the gas curtain." A burst of high-pressure air was released from the submarine's external vents, creating a massive cloud of bubbles that acted as an acoustic mirror. The torpedo's sonar pings hit the air-water interface of the bubbles and scattered in 1,000 different directions. The torpedo, suddenly blinded, began a circle search pattern, its internal computer trying to reacquire the target. "The torpedo has lost lock," the sonar technician called out, a note of triumph in his voice. "It's circling the bubble cloud. Range is holding at 300 yards. Maintain flank speed," Miller said, refusing to relax. "We are heading for the continental shelf. The water gets shallow there, only 60 meters deep. It's a nightmare for their long-range sonar because of the bottom bounce interference, but it's our only way out of the box." The North Carolina surged forward, its reactor operating at 95% power. The submarine moved like a massive, silent shark through the darkness, leaving the confused torpedoes and the frantic Chinese frigates behind. The tactical egress was a masterpiece of underwater geometry. By moving into the shallower, rockier waters of the shelf, Miller was using the very terrain the Chinese thought would trap him as a shield against their sensors. Back on the surface, the commander of the Binzhou watched his screen in frustration as the two torpedoes ran out of fuel and self-destructed, sending two distant, muffled thuds through the water. The ghost had vanished again. The East China Sea was once more a landscape of shadows, but the fires at Zhoushan were still burning, a testament to the fact that the ghost could strike whenever it chose. 3:15 in the morning. The edge of the continental shelf, 100 miles east of the Ningbo coastline. The USS North Carolina had reached the designated sanctuary zone, a region of deep, turbulent water where the cold currents of the Pacific floor collided with the warmer surface layers, creating a chaotic acoustic environment that made active sonar search almost impossible. Commander Miller ordered the boat to a dead stop, hovering at 350 meters. It was time to assess the butcher's bill. The mission was not over until the data from the strike was verified, and the boat's own combat readiness was quantified for the next phase of the campaign. Inside the radio shack, the communications officer worked with a high-speed burst transmitter. Because the Chinese regional command at Zhoushan was effectively blind, the risk of detecting a millisecond-long satellite uplink was significantly reduced. The submarine extended its multifunction mast just a few feet above the whitecaps, long enough to pull down the latest battle damage assessment from a United States Keyhole-class reconnaissance satellite passing over the Eastern Theater. "Captain, we have the imagery downlink," the intelligence officer said, his voice echoing through the quiet control room. "Resolution is down to 10 centimeters. Thermal infrared confirms multiple sustained fires across the entire Zhoushan complex. Thermal infrared confirms multiple sustained fires across the entire Zhoushan complex." Commander Miller leaned over the light table as the high-resolution frames populated the screen. The images were a stark, monochromatic record of the 12 missile salvos' efficiency. Of the 12 Tomahawk land attack missiles launched, 10 had achieved direct hits on their primary or secondary targets. The 2 intercepts by the Chinese close-in weapon systems had occurred over open water or unpopulated hillsides, failing to prevent the core mission objectives. The assessment was systematic and devastating. The 4 primary satellite communication arrays, the ears of the Chinese regional fleet, were completely leveled, their heavy steel pedestals twisted into blackened scrap. The main command and control center showed a massive 10-meter crater where the roof had collapsed, with thermal sensors indicating internal temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Celsius for 40 minutes following the impact. The Pier 7 communication vaults, the primary hardline hub for the Eastern Theater Command, were a total loss, effectively isolating the naval base from the mainland military grid. Estimating enemy personnel casualties at 145, the intelligence officer continued, reading from the automated report. This includes approximately 30% of the senior duty staff for the Eastern Theater Command. The logistical impact is severe. The Pier 7 fuel farm is still burning, and we estimate 40,000 tons of marine diesel have been lost. The power substation destruction has taken 85% of the island's military infrastructure offline. Miller looked at the numbers. In terms of cost-to-benefit ratio, the strike was a strategic masterpiece. For the price of 12 missiles and a few hours of high-risk maneuvering, the United States Navy had effectively paralyzed the most dangerous naval headquarters in the Western Pacific. However, the North Carolina's own logistics were now a concern. The mission had exhausted the boat's entire primary strike inventory. The 12 Virginia payload tubes were now empty, their high-pressure ejection systems requiring a full reset at a specialized tender or a friendly port. While the submarine still carried 24 Mark 48 ADCAP torpedoes in its racks, it was no longer a land attack platform. It was now a pure hunter-killer, and its mission would shift to protecting the extraction of the carrier strike group that was currently moving into the sector to capitalize on the Chinese confusion. Logistics report for the chief of boat, Miller ordered. I want a full count of our remaining consumables and a status check on the reactor core. The report came back within minutes. The submarine had 75% of its food and oxygen-scrubbing chemicals remaining, enough for another 45 days at sea. The nuclear reactor was operating at peak efficiency, but the cooling pumps had been stressed during the flank speed escape from the Chinese frigates. More importantly, the boat had used 4 of its 6 acoustic decoys and 3 of its gas curtain canisters to evade the Yu-8 torpedoes. To remain a viable combatant in a high-intensity environment, the North Carolina would need to rendezvous with the submarine tender USS Emory S. Land, which was currently positioned 400 miles to the south, guarded by a destroyer escort. The air inside the control room felt heavy, smelling of ozone and the dry, metallic scent of the air scrubbing units. The crew was exhausted, but maintained a professional edge. They knew that the decapitation of Zhoushan was only the opening move. Somewhere in the dark waters around them, dozens of Chinese submarines, the Kilo class and Type 039C boats would be surging out of their pens, seeking revenge for the destruction of their headquarters. The tactical vacuum we've created won't last forever, Miller said to his executive officer. The Chinese will establish a backup command node at Ningbo or Shanghai within 12 hours. We need to be out of this box and joined up with Carrier Strike Group 5 before they get their eyes back. Set a course for the Miyako Strait. Depth 400 meters. Speed 15 knots. We're going deep, and we're staying quiet. The USS North Carolina turned its nose toward the deep trenches of the Philippine Sea. The ghost of the East China Sea was moving south, leaving behind a ruined fortress and a regional superpower that was, for the first time in decades, truly afraid of what was lurking beneath the waves. 5 in the morning. The deep, cold trenches of the Philippine Sea, 200 miles southeast of the Miyako Strait. The USS North Carolina had successfully transited the narrow choke point between Okinawa and Miyako Island, slipping through the gap at 600 meters depth, while the Chinese surface fleet was still frantically searching the shallow waters of the East China Sea. For the first time in 72 hours, the sonar waterfall display was clear of active pings. The silence of the deep ocean had returned, a vast and heavy stillness that felt like a physical relief to the exhausted crew of the 7,800-ton submarine. Inside the control room, the red tactical lighting had been switched back to a soft, professional blue. Commander Miller stood at the navigation plot, reviewing the final mission summary before it was encrypted for transmission to Pacific Command in Hawaii. The operation had been a textbook execution of the Decapitation doctrine, but the cost of such high-intensity combat was written in the weary eyes and slumped shoulders of his sailors. The strategic results of Operation Iron Ghost were now being felt across the entire Pacific theater. Satellite intercepts confirmed that for exactly 4 hours following the impact at Zhoushan, the Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy had ceased all coordinated movement. Without the centralized data links and command authority of the Eastern Theater headquarters, individual ship captains had reverted to defensive stay-clear zones, effectively abandoning the offensive screen that had been pressuring the regional allies. The brain of the regional naval machine had been physically erased, and the resulting tactical vacuum allowed Carrier Strike Group 5 to move into a superior striking position without a single shot being fired in their direction. The cost to the United States forces was light but measurable. The USS North Carolina had expended 12 Tomahawk land attack missiles, 4 Mark 48 advanced capability torpedoes used as defensive fire, and 5 of its 6 acoustic decoys. The high-speed escape through the continental shelf had placed a significant strain on the main coolant pumps of the S-9G nuclear reactor, requiring a scheduled maintenance period once the boat reached a safe harbor. 2 sailors in the torpedo room had suffered broken ribs and minor lacerations when the boat executed its emergency snap turn to evade the Chinese torpedoes, but both were stable and under the care of the ship's corpsmen. The enemy losses were catastrophic. The destruction of the Zhoushan Command and Control Center had resulted in the confirmed deaths of 42 senior officers, including the theater's Vice Admiral of Operations. The loss of the Pier 7 fuel farm and the satellite arrays had neutralized the base as a functional staging ground for at least 6 months. More importantly, the psychological invincibility of the Chinese Iron Curtain had been shattered. A single American submarine had penetrated the most heavily defended waters in the world and struck at the very heart of the command structure. At 5:15 in the morning, the North Carolina made its final rendezvous. On the sonar screens, the rhythmic, powerful thrum of 4 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers appeared, moving at 25 knots. These were the escorts of Carrier Strike Group 5, the Steel Ring, that would protect the submarine as it surfaced to begin the long process of replenishment. "Captain, we have a secure voice link with the destroyer USS Mason," the communications officer reported. "They are signaling, 'Well done.' They've cleared a corridor for us to come to the surface." "Very well," Miller said, a small, tired smile finally appearing on his face. "Bring us up to periscope depth. Clear the vents. Let's get some fresh air into this boat." The USS North Carolina began its slow, graceful ascent. As the sail broke the surface of the Philippine Sea, the first light of dawn was beginning to touch the horizon, turning the water from a deep indigo to a bright, shimmering gold. The air that rushed into the hull through the induction masts was cold, clean, and smelled of the open Pacific. To the world, the strike at Zhoushan would be debated in the halls of power for years, a turning point in a conflict that many feared would have no end. But for the men of the North Carolina, the mission ended with a simple, professional satisfaction. They had gone into the dark, they had spoken with a voice of fire, and they had returned. The ghost of the East China Sea was home, its job finished, and the silence of the ocean was theirs once again.